This is the future of stress testing because it's looking at the subtle energy fields in the body. Our bodies are always looking for the path of least resistance, which is one of the main reasons why you want to cycle peptides. You don't want to do the same supplements long term. You always want to be putting new stressors on your body. The thing that we probably don't talk about enough is the fact that your mental and emotional state can be one of the biggest blockages in your pursuit of longevity. What we're going to look at is, yes, your brain waves, and we'll see if they are expressed at the appropriate time of the day. We're also going to look at the level of balance in your brain. Colors of your brain can be very indicative of how much trauma there is in your brain. Welcome, everybody. Interesting thing we're going to be covering today, well, hopefully, I think it's interesting to me at least, is it's a new test that we're doing called NeuroChek. And the great thing about this diagnostic test is we can show you the age of your brain. We can also show you the way that your brain waves are functioning. We can show you where there is imbalances in your central nervous system and autonomic nervous system, which is really critical because I know there's times of my life where I've had a lot more stress and, even before I really understood how to mitigate some of the autoimmune conditions in my body, my stress tolerance was much lower than what it is now. And if I would have had this diagnostic device, 20, 30 years ago, I just can't imagine how much different things would be today. And so we don't have the luxury of going back in time, but this is a test as we go through it today that I'm going to show you some before and afters. I'll talk to you about some of the great things that we're finding with it. I just returned from kind of a whirlwind trips where I've been in. I was able to go to Monaco. I got invited to do a Grand Prix with the Thank You Romains. It was such a phenomenal time there. And then my wife and I, we went over to Pietra Laguerre in Italy, and we mountain biked all over there. Well, I did. She would prefer to skip out on some of the crazy adventures, but I mountain biked all over and loved it. We went to Genoa, Milan. It's such a cool place. And then we opened up New Jersey the next week and did a big event for the Enlightened Entrepreneur Group in Rochester. Met some really phenomenal people. And the greatest thing that we were able to accomplish during this time was to run about 100 of these tests. And so today what I'll do is I'll introduce a new technology. And so for those of you who, I know several of you are planning on joining us for the retreat this month, I believe it's June 25th, but don't quote me on that, but it's coming up. But we'll be doing this test on all of you before the event starts, and then we'll do it afterwards as well. So what is this test? Well, it's called a NeuroChek. And for those of you who understand the dangers of stress in your life, first of all, how many of you have too much stress and would love to get rid of it if you could? And I think this test is, kind of a motivator because it will show you exactly where the stress is showing up in your nervous system, and you may take it a little more seriously. So Bill, yep, good to have you on. Let me pull this up and let's dive in. So this is the future of stress testing because it's looking at the subtle energy fields in the body. So the body's electric, but your body has different wavelengths that circulate through your brain. When we're sleeping, we have different wavelengths than when we're awake. When we're agitated, you're going to notice that your body produces, the sensory output that responds to the stress. And so when you look at the autonomic nervous system, one of the most important nerves that connects it all is called the vagus nerve, and that's the wandering nerve. And what the vagus nerve does is it helps activate your parasympathetic nervous system, which is generally known as your rest and digest. But it also activates a lot of these like catecholamines and epinephrine, norepinephrine. So it can be the gas pedal and the brake. But that vagus nerve and having great vagal tone is probably one of the most important pathways in your body to create this regulation of the gas pedal and the brake, because Every system has a negative feedback loop. It doesn't matter if you're talking biological systems, if you're talking about physics, if you're talking business systems, there's always inputs and there's always outputs, and things need to be modified. The human body will never stay the same for very long. It's called the law of entropy. And so the law of entropy means that our bodies are always looking for the path of least resistance, which is one of the main reasons why you want to cycle peptides. You don't want to do the same supplements long term. You always want to be putting new stressors on your body, which is one reason I do a full year of a challenge, and then I have micro experiments throughout the course of that year so that I can make sure that I'm not falling into that comfort crisis. There's a great book called The Comfort Crisis, by the way. But that comfort crisis is when, if I'm only doing a certain style of lifting in the gym, if I'm never increasing my weight, if I'm never increasing my reps, if I'm not pushing my body through full range of motion, things start to atrophy, because that's the law of entropy. And stress is no different. If you're always just continually beating up your sympathetic nervous system because all of you are ambitious humans, you're striving to be the best version of yourself, and you have a lot of people who count on you, well, it's easy to push ourselves beyond what our nervous system can recover from. And if you do that long enough, it will start to show up in your scan. And now we're going to have data beyond just your blood work and your stool tests. Those are really important, don't get me wrong. But now we have a very direct way of understanding exactly what stress is doing to your brain, your energy centers. We'll be talking about your chakra systems. We'll talk about your meridians. And I'll even show you how we can get a rough idea of how old your brain may or may not be, or how young your brain is. So this was a test. Dr. Jeffrey Gladden introduced this at Da Vinci 50. And I got super interested in it. First, I thought, this is, what is it? It takes 5 minutes. Is it real? And then I reached out to the manufacturer, reached out to some of the scientists, and sure enough, I was like, okay, this is a really cool test, because the real thing it's looking at is heart rate variability, and then it's able to map out different pathways and look at the bioelectrical impedance in different areas of the body. And so the heart rate variability, what that means is it's your body's ability to contract and relax. And this is heart rate variability, just a screenshot from an Oura ring. And having an average heart rate variability of 99 milliseconds is really amazing. A maximum 144 milliseconds. And heart rate variability, by the way, more is not always better. Generally speaking, it is, but we just don't know. Everybody has their own heart rate variability set point. And so what we're looking for are averages of heart rate variability. And if there's significant drops or significant spikes, then we want to look at this subjectively and say, okay, what was it that triggered it? Because I've seen some people who have contracted infections, for example, like Lyme disease. And interestingly enough, their heart rate variability goes up. I've also seen people who've had massive trauma, like head trauma from automobile accidents. And I saw the patient's heart rate variability go up. And I said, that doesn't really make sense. But while we don't know everything, or I don't know everything, I'm sure someone knows a lot more about heart rate variability than I do. But I don't always see there's a linear pathway to higher is better. But what I do see is that your heart rate variability, and generally speaking, you want to be like 40 to 100. Anything below that seems to be a little bit problematic. It means your heart is not getting the breaks it needs. And so for those of you who use an Oura ring, a Garmin, an Apple Watch, I think Apple Watch does it now, but you can test your heart rate variability and see how you're doing. So generally speaking, a higher HRV indicates better adaptability and resilience. Lower can indicate stress, fatigue, or future health issues. So if you look at these two pathways, your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, remember it's the vagus nerve that basically is the governor of both of these, and it's getting the inputs and sending the outputs into the system. But the autonomic nervous system is all governed by your brain. And every movement in your body is governed by your brain. That's called neuromuscular adaptation. Every single rhythm in your body, the detoxification pathways, everything has nerves in there. Anywhere there's a blood vessel, you're going to have a nerve. Any place that's alive in your body, you're going to have a blood vessel. So hopefully if you start looking at the body more integrated, in anatomy, we just combine like the brain and the nerves. It's like one system, because if I just had your nerve and we pulled a little nerve on the bottom of your foot and you had nothing else interfering, your brain would move just a little bit. That's kind of a weird analogy, weird image, but hopefully you get the point. But then you have a feedback system. So remember, there's negative feedback loops, positive feedback loops in any system, and the body is just this very dynamic system, and it's systems upon systems. It's the more I learn about human physiology, the more I realize I don't know, which is why I love having these cool events with you guys. And one reason I love going on the road or having you guys come into the office is because I'm always presenting some of the new findings. But this is no different. The parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, it's much more complex than what it's revealed here. But one thing that I've learned over time is that if you can create some harmony between these systems and not look at one being better than the other, that's when you can really gain an enormous amount of health. Like, just think about, when do you recover the best? And it's after you pushed yourself really hard. It's really hard to have a rest day or recovery day if you haven't pushed yourself. Like, I can't imagine, I have, clients or neighbors, whoever, and it's like, yeah, if you're not pushing yourself hard, it's really hard to want to push on the brakes. But, if you have really good health on both sides of the system, that means you can have a lot of energy output, but then you also have the inputs to restore your nervous system. And the other thing that's interesting is, even as you're in a stressful state, like my wife can instantly know, like if I'm overwhelmed or if something's off emotionally. And I was like, you're like a detective. Like it's not a big deal. I just need to work through this thing. Maybe there's like some stress at work, or we had, a patient not happy, and those things do get to me from time to time. I've gotten much better, but it does impact me. And she can sense my aura. She doesn't use those words, but even as we measured all these biofields in over 100 people over the last couple of weeks, you start to see that there's a diminishing level of output when it comes to the biofields. And if you're familiar with the chakras, it's not, it's definitely not something that I know a lot about. But all I know is there's different areas of the body where there's energy centers from an Ayurvedic medicine perspective. And one thing the NeuroChek can do is actually determine where you've got good flow in each of these chakras. And we just found that the people who had the brains that had the least amount of circulation in their brains, they were also the ones that had the lowest level of biofield energy, or the smallest amount of aura. So how many of you have been around somebody and they just exude like just enormous amounts of vitality, and you're just like, whoa, they are just like beaming, and then you also see people who are just like, wow, they really need a hug. They're having a hard day. And then some people, it feels like a energy vacuum. But I think what we realized is, chronic stress, it impacts all of us. And at some stage, just like we challenge you guys every week to get serious about your longevity, serious about your health, don't take it for granted. But the thing that we probably don't talk about enough is the fact that your mental and emotional state can be one of the biggest blockages in your pursuit of longevity. And so for the ageless future that we are in pursuit of creating for each one of you, we realized that we need a little better way of measuring some of the stress. And some of the ways that we've done this is through this new science of NeuroChek, which I'm really excited about. So one of the things you'll notice is you get the test, and yes, you do have to come in person. I don't know how we can execute on it when you live, when you're not in person, because literally it's a positive and negative charge that completes that reading. You have to have that bioelectrical machine to test it. We just plug it into our computer, but it's a really sophisticated device that can sense these biorhythms. But one thing we look at are these fractals, and fractals, these are patterns in nature, and these fractals, they create a massive vibration. And so you look at the fractal patterns in your biorhythms. And biorhythms are just, it's a fancy word for, just the pulse of your biology, the way that your heart pulses, the way that your brain pulses. You've got the cerebral spinal fluid that has this its own rhythm. You've got your heart that's got its own rhythm, but they all are, when things are harmonized, they all work together nicely. This curve that shows the actual age of the brain from chronological age versus biological age. And by the way, I think the biological age is a lot more accurate than your actual age. So hopefully those of you on this, are having birthdays every 18 or 24 months now. I spoke to one of my clients, and we ran some markers that we ran about a year ago that showed him the health of the length of his telomeres and the amount of methylation in the DNA. And he was 11 years younger from the true diagnostic test. So he was really excited. He's like, well, I actually I feel like 20 years younger, and I look 20 years younger. And he was showing me before and after pictures, and he does. He looks at least 10 years younger. So I think that needs to be our new metric, is biological age. And we actually have these new formulas that I've got our engineering team that they're building. So pretty soon we'll have an app that captures everything. So this test is just one measurement where they're looking at all of the scans that have ever been done. And that's how they're predicting your biological age versus chronological age. Not the most accurate assessment. So we don't place a ton of emphasis on this. It is important. And then when you look at the functional states, one of the things that we're looking at is this cardiovascular adaptation. And what that means is, what's your output like? Can you go and run really fast and then recover? Or do you need a little more time to reset? And then the cardiovascular adaptation also allows you to have good aerobic capacity and anaerobic capacity. The second thing we're going to measure is your autonomic nervous system regulation. So how well does it self-regulate? Are you always stuck in one side or the other? If you're always in a parasympathetic state, you're going to get tired a lot. You're going to feel kind of burned out. You may actually end up having like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. These are some of the symptoms that can show up there, and burnout is a big one on that autonomic nervous system regulation. The neurohumoral regulation shows the movement of the neurotransmitters and the electrical patterns that go along with it. And then that psycho-emotional state is where you can see the amount of energy burden or blockage from some of the emotional traumas and psychological stressors. So the third thing or the fourth thing on this chart that we're testing is the complex state index. And this one, we're looking at these numbers, and ideally, most of these numbers you want to be, in the 80% range. Complex state just shows your brain power, your ability to be able to focus on things for long periods of time without distraction. And, I had one client who we did his, and his was like 85%. It was the best we've seen on the complex state. And I asked him, I'm like, he's more of, he does a lot of investment analysis and real estate syndicates, things like that. And so I was like, how do you do on days where you have a ton of data, where you just have to focus in on like spreadsheets and graphs and understanding, and predicting certain outcomes. And he's like, oh, those are my favorite days. I can work nonstop. I forget to eat lunch, so he had that complex state really well. The one thing that surprised me, and the reason I bring this up as a group, because I know how hard you guys push yourselves, but what I'm seeing in the daytime is people have more energy in the delta waves and the theta waves. And you can see there's delta, there's theta, and I think you guys, you probably have heard of delta sleep. And delta sleep waves is when you drop into, the more the REM sleep and deep sleep, your body goes into this deep, deep delta state of sleep. And that's where like time stands still and you can be asleep for like 6 hours straight. And if something wakes you up in the middle of the night or whenever early in the morning, you feel like you just barely fell asleep, but that's delta. And then theta is what brings us to that level right before we fall into deep sleep, where you're kind of in a light sleep. So it's also more that REM cycle, and the REM cycle goes through theta and delta states, primarily theta, and then the delta is more that deep sleep. But I'm seeing people where they're elevated in the day, even in the morning when we took it at like 10 in the morning. And so the problem is that's because they didn't sleep great the night before. It wasn't a restorative sleep. And then what happens is our brains get really tired, and that's where we need a lot of stimulants. And we don't feel the motivation that we'd like. And what we really want to do is make sure in the day that you have like gamma high, especially gamma waves relate to very high levels of learning, as alpha and beta are more about creativity and having drive and having ambition and excitement around your work and around your day. And so you can see, like, if you can manage the energy systems in your brain, you can manage the energy systems in your body. And if you can manage the energy systems in your body, you can manage the energy systems of your life. And it's really key because it's not the time that we have. Time is our most valuable resource. I've heard that time and time again. Speaking of time, but actually it's the energy that you have is the most valuable resource, because I know I've had hours of my life that I could not do anything because I was so exhausted. Like when I had giardia, for example. I had giardia and I was hiking. We did a backpacking trip for about a week in Tucson, Arizona. I can't remember the name of the park. It was so gorgeous. And this was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And I got actually 20 years ago. And I got giardia on my way out. And because our pump broke. And so my friend and I were like, well, let's take a risk. And we hoped that the water was clean enough, but we had like 12 miles of hiking when the pump fell. There was a seal that broke. And we're at the end of the camping trip. But anyway, I remember I would work. And for about 2 weeks, I lost, I think, 15, 20 pounds. I could fit in my wife's pants. She was not very happy about that. But I would tease her by putting on her pants. But I was so exhausted. I just couldn't even read. And so it's that energy management that's real key. And so when we do the test, what we're going to look at is, yes, your brain waves, and we'll see if they are expressed at the appropriate time of the day. We're also going to look at the level of balance in your brain. So if you look at the colors of your brain can be very indicative of how much trauma there is in your brain. And so if you have a state of maximum balance, you'll see maximum movement of the electrical energy is going to be that dark blue color. And you'll see when the brain's more in a stable, it will have kind of the teal and green color with some of the dark blue. And then when it's just and that's when it's 66 to 83% stable. When it's 50 to 66% balanced, you'll see a nice green and nice light blue. And I can tell you we had very few people that were, where the brain was at the maximum balance. I didn't see anybody. Most people, we were happy if they were in that 50 to 66%. And that was less than 10% of the tests we did. And until we treated, we had a couple before and after, which was really fascinating to see. But you'll see when there's a lot of accumulated tiredness, you'll see the brain, there's just kind of like green, and then there's red and yellow. And then you'll see, light little patches of red and the yellow. And that's where you've got 33 to 50% of accumulated tiredness. When you've got like only 17 to 33% of energy moving in the brain, you'll have the nervous system that's overstrained. And this is where most people's brains were. And it's too bad, because I realized it's not your fault. We have big goals in life. And then we also have a society that demands a lot of us. And the great thing, and hopefully what you get out of today is that when you take care of yourself, and when you take care of yourself in a way where you push yourself really hard doing the things you love to do and exercise or creative projects, but then you also equally give the energy and attention to the things that allow you to relax and think differently. Listen to music. It changes your brainwaves. Doing things like painting, or if you're writing, if that's a creative outlet for you, just go find the enjoyable activities and do more of those. I can tell you my brainwaves changed dramatically just after mountain biking, even if I pushed myself really hard. And then you can see in the high stress levels, we had a few people that were 0 to 17%. And those patients we actually sent in to get a functional MRI of their brains. So we made sure that there's, not something else going on, like, risk of stroke, or even if you've had what's called a TIA, a trans ischemic attack, where you have these mini strokes. We just, I don't know. We haven't got the data back yet, but I want to make sure we're not missing anything. So this is what your test will show. We're going to show that neurohumoral regulation. We'll show the energy resources. In this particular case, the patient had 93. We want you between 150 and 600. And so only having, 93 out of that, there's just going to be an enormous amount of mental fatigue if you have to push yourself at all. And then the neurohumoral regulation, at 22%, it just means like stuck in stress. And then you can see the electrical activity of the brain, where it's mostly red and a little green, a little yellow. So that's like where you're about 33% of the energy of your brain is being utilized, is all because there's so much stress on it. In this particular patient, you can see the high delta, high theta. This patient had a lot of depression, and you could see it in his eyes. He was just like flat. And his brother asked me to, talk to him and do the scan and then see if he'd be open to working with us, which he was. And then we did it after, and it was like a completely new man. So, but these are interesting. I'd love to see yours. This is the after we treated him. And this was literally within 8 hours. We treated him. It was 6:30 on Pacific time. So about 9:30 in the morning. And we treated him again at 5:30. So almost 8 hours later, after we did intranasal stem cells, and we did exosomes, I believe. And then we also he came to my peptide party. So for those of you who've been to the peptide party, you know what it's like. It's fun. We do a lot of different peptides like glutathione, neuro-NAD. But look at the difference in his brain and the power output. His power output improved by more than 100%. His energy balance landed right on par. His neurohumoral, that neurotransmitter regulation, that cleared up. It went from like 22%, 22% to 64%. So once again, you can see the before and after. Look at his brain here on that lower left corner. And then now look at it. It went from 30% to 74%. And then all his brain waves. And ideally in the evening, you want a little more theta. And his delta came down substantially. His delta came down, almost 200% there. And then his alpha was high. So he was now more engaged, and you could see it in his eyes. I mean, he looked like when you'd see him if you saw this man in the morning versus in the evening, two different men. And it was just a small little thing. Here was his biofield analysis before, 28%. Moved all the way up to 67%. And so one of the things you can do with this device is you can use a brain tap. For those of you who've ever tried this, it's a really cool treatment. It gets you in this nice area where you can activate your heart rate variability. And you can just go to, I think it's braintap.com. We've had it in the office for a long time. We just haven't had the diagnostic. So, all right. So that's the new test. And how many of you would like to get that done? So you're just going to have to come to Utah and come hang out, or come to one of our events. And we've got more and more events coming up in the future. But before we finish today's session, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you guys. Help us find new innovation and your feedback and all the cool opportunities we have. So I'm happy to take any questions. Bill, hell yeah. Bill, was that helpful in actually understanding what that test was at DaVinci 50? Hopefully that gave you, Bill and I did this test there. And Bill was actually the one that was like, hey, have you seen this? And so I was like, yeah, let me look into it. And I didn't really know much, was very skeptical. But then after a few days and doing more research, I was like, this is great. And then running at 100 people, it is dead on, because I didn't know anything about their health history. And then as I was reading their report, I could tell them what was going on. And they were like, are you some kind of psychic? I'm like, no, Nope, I'm just reading the data. Jane, we'd love to run an event in Sydney. I've actually never been to Australia. And when I was a kid, I was obsessed with Australia. And I've traveled a lot. And so let's host an event. Just, let's get the word out. We do a lot of YPO events. So I'm sure we could get something happening down there. Man, we have a lot of clients. We've had a lot of clients over the years from down there, and they would love it if we made a trek down, especially if I had some special deliveries for you guys. Okay, good. Well, yes, if you can get an event, I would love to make that happen. How cool. All right. Well, you guys are awesome. Appreciate you all. And I will see you next week. Thanks, everybody.